several regulars in here. That's always good to see. Folks who come back for more, and also some new folks, so that's always good. So it's almost half and half. Glad that y'all are here. I know with COVID things have been different, and it's been about 1.5 years since I've been doing this, so I decided to start over from scratch and start back with kind of a brief overview of Suwannee County history. As I was telling some folks earlier, at this point it's a 36 lesson presentation going over Suwannee County history from all the way back up to more or less modern day. Some we get into more detail than others, but the first presentation is always an overview, the brief overview I call it. Sometimes it's 45 minutes, sometimes it's 1.5 hours. I'll try to be more on the 45-minute side. Last week it was about 45 minutes, so I did pretty well. But first off, for those who don't know who I am, the about me, I'm a 7th generation Suwannee County citizen, born and raised here, went to school here. I was salutatorian for the high school in '96, and I was valedictorian of a university the next year with a BS degree in history. The joke is that I got a BS from FU. Not always funny, but some people find that funny. I have worked for more than 23 years now at the Suwannee County Clerk of the Court's office. I thought originally I was going to be teaching history. That's kind of what I'd gone to school for. And I'm not, but I still am in a way by doing things like this. I'm allowed to do this as part of my office job as the county's historian, among other things, records manager and whatnot. So I've got lots of different duties that I perform, but I love talking about history, and that's really my first passion with my job and with my degree. So 23 plus years there. I've also been the youngest member of the Suwannee County Historical Commission for the last 18 plus years since I've been on. I was the treasurer between '07 and 2014, and I've been the chairman since 2014. So I'm not sure if that says that I'm still the youngest member, but we have a good group of folks that volunteer and that do a lot of work to help preserve and present Suwannee County's history. We also run the Suwannee County Historical Museum, which we took over 2 or 3 years ago. So if you have not been there, please go. I'm glad some of the folks that are here have visited. There's lots of good stuff in there. Also, as far as I know, unless something's changed in the last year, I was the youngest citizen to receive the Suwannee County Chamber of Commerce Trailblazer Award, and that was 10 years ago now. And that was for somebody who, in my case, was presenting and trying to push Suwannee County history as much as I have, and so I was awarded that, and I was very honored to have that. Up until last year, I was doing weekly articles in the Suwannee Democrat until it shut down last year due to COVID and other things. So that was 7 years weekly presentation or weekly articles in the newspaper. I've also published so far 5 books related to Suwannee County history. 4 of them are nonfiction, one's historical fiction, but they're all related and tied into Suwannee County's history. I've also been mentioned in the New York Times, the Washington Post, London Daily Mail, pretty much in newspapers all around the world. Now that was for one specific event, which I'll mention later on in this presentation, but that was pretty cool to see my name in newspapers all around the world. And I've been married for more than 22 years, 22 and a half years at this point, with 2 living children. So that is the about me. Some of you already knew most of that, others may not have, but that's me. Again, when I talk about Suwannee County history, sometimes I'm talking about my family. Sometimes it's the good, the bad, the different, indifferent, or the we don't know about it. I learn about myself, I learn about my family, I learn about my heritage, and maybe some of you, a lot of you that I know of anyway, are not born here, but you've moved here, you've liked it, and so perhaps that will help you learn more about where you live now. Moving on, early history. Now, Suwannee County was the 37th county created in Florida on December 21st, 1858. And the joke that some of you have heard probably a dozen times by now, if you've been here enough, I remember the date because it's my wife's birthday, but not the year, which I have to point out to her. That I don't mean the year, honey. But December 21st, 1858, we broke off from Columbia County at that point, which Columbia County encompassed a lot more area than it does now, and we became our own county. Now, Suwannee, from Suwannee County, people aren't too sure where it comes from. There's lots of different ideas. Some folks think that it comes from the original Native American word Suwannee, meaning something like echo waters, echo river, muddy water, different variations of that idea. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. What I seem to look in doing research is the old maps show the Suwannee River being named by the Spanish as Rio San Juan de Guacara, which means River of St. John of Antiquity, talking about John the Apostle in the Bible. So as the times changed and it shifted from Spanish ownership to English ownership and eventually to American ownership, it seems like they kind of dropped the Rio part and the San Juan de Guacara kind of got shortened to San Juan de Suwannee. So that may or may not be accurate as well. Or it could be they just, the Spanish, when they named the river, named it after what the Indians were calling it. I'm going to use the word Indians. I'm not trying to offend anybody, but sometimes I will use Native Americans. Sometimes I'll use the word Indian. It's just one of those things. I'm not trying to offend anybody. I hope nobody will be offended by it. But the Native Americans may have called it Suwannee or may not. But if that is true, that the Suwannee River is named after St. John the Apostle, which it is by the Spanish anyway, that means we've got two rivers in North Florida named after these, St. John's over there by Jacksonville, and then the Suwannee River. So that's kind of interesting. Just like there are two Withlacoochee rivers in Florida. You may not have known either. All right, moving on. Early history, even before we became a county, that area that we know of today as Suwannee County has been inhabited for thousands of years. Lots of Native American Indian groups have lived here. Some of them, like the Weedon Island culture, which thrived in this area between 200 and 750 AD or 200 and 900 AD, depending on who you talk to. With these early years especially, there's a lot of disagreement between archaeologists, between anthropologists, and historians as to how long different Native American groups lived here. So there's variations. You'll see all kinds of numbers all over the place, but some of them were called the Weedon Island culture. Those are some pictures from not Suwannee County, but I believe some of that's Columbia County, from some digs that were done a few years ago. They flourished, again, 1,500 years ago, almost 2,000 years ago. And then by the time the Europeans arrived in the 1500s into Florida and what's now Suwannee County, this group of people was here, the Tamuqua or Tamuqua, there's different ways people pronounce it. But these Native Americans had been here for hundreds of years by that point, almost 750 by that point. They came to dominate, dominate not only North Florida, but also South Georgia, all the way up to like the Altamaha River and whatnot. A very fierce, warlike group of Native Americans. They were also farmers, as you can see from that drawing. And we know a lot more about them because, again, they were the ones that were here when the Europeans arrived. So the Europeans were able to write about them in a lot of details. Now, the Tamuqua are basically extinct at this point. The last known Tamuqua survivor died in 1767. So a lot of other Native American tribes, like the Seminoles and whatnot, you can read about, or you can go visit the reservations. You're not going to find a true Tamuqua reservation because they're gone. They have not been around for hundreds of years at this point due to European conquest, due to disease, due to other Native American cultures capturing them or assimilating them. So the Tamuqua are basically extinct. We'll talk more about them and some of the other Native American tribes next month. Now then, Europeans arriving in Florida, the first known European to arrive in what's now the area of Suwannee County is this guy on the left, Pamphilio de Narvaez. He arrived in the 1520s. He and 400 men came up through Tampa Bay and came through the Suwannee River or Suwannee Valley area, moving through. And in the process of traveling, trying to learn more about this unknown region and trying to basically take it for Spain, for the Spanish Empire, they went through a lot of hardships. Out of those 400 people, only 4 survived, and it took them 7 years to get back to other Spanish areas, which was actually Mexico was the closest they got to. So 7 years later, 4 out of the 400 survived. One of those guys was a guy named Cabeza de Vaca, which means head of cow in Spanish, which was an honorary name given to him by the ancestors for fighting the Moors, but that's something we'll talk about later on. One of those funny little stories. But Mr. Head of Cow, or Cabeza de Vaca as he's known by everybody else, he wrote a kind of fanciful story about his travels, which brought others in, including the guy to the right, who's Hernando de Soto. He started traveling into Florida in 1539. He had 600 people with him. He was more knowledgeable of the territory because he had heard what was, from what was left of the survivors anyway, a little bit more what was going on in North Florida and the area. So he was able to be a little bit more prepared, and regardless of that, it took his group 4 years to travel basically the southeastern United States, or what is today the southeastern United States. DeSoto actually died in 1542, close to the Mississippi River. He didn't make it, but most of his folks did. And they got back 4 years later with a wealth of information, wealth of knowledge, and more understanding of how the southeastern United States looked, so that Spain could take it as part of their empire. That led to, over the next 100 years, what we call the Spanish period, or the first Spanish period of Florida's history. The Spanish moved in after those explorers, those conquistadors came in and explored. They were able to start pushing missions in. Missionaries came in, Franciscan and other types of Catholic mission system came in and established mission sites, first on the coast of Florida, around Jacksonville, St. Augustine, that area, but then they made their way inland. And so by the mid-1600s, Suwannee County had several mission sites. Unfortunately, it did not last that long, because by the early 1700s, especially between 1702 and 1705, the English, who they were at war with the Spanish, came in from the Carolinas mainly and brought in some of their Native American allies and wiped out the mission system in North Florida. All that was left basically was Pensacola and St. Augustine. Everything else, interior Florida, had been destroyed. So those mission sites, including the ones in Suwannee County, were gone. This picture is actually not in Suwannee County. If you've been to Tallahassee, maybe you've seen it, the Appalachian mission site that they have rebuilt. Nice place there, lots of stuff. That was a nice big mission site. Suwannee counties were not quite as big as this. Well, what happened was, by the mid-1700s, what we call the French and Indian War had broken out. 1756, it ended in 1763. We call it the French and Indian War. I don't know if in history you learned that as that. The rest of the world calls it the 7 Years' War because it lasted 7 years for them. By the end of that war, Spain pretty much agreed to give up Florida to England or to Great Britain because they wanted back some of their other territories, like Cuba, that they saw as more valuable. So basically they traded some of those territories and said, England, you can have Florida. So that began what was called the English period of Florida's history. It only lasted 20 years, from 1763 to 1783. While that's going on in European politics, we've got these other groups of Native Americans moving in because the Spanish have been kicked out. The Spanish allies, their Indian allies, like the Tamuqua, who have now died off by this point, have abandoned Florida, and so other Indian or Native American tribes have moved in from the Carolinas, from Georgia, from Tennessee, the upper lower creeks, the Yamasee, the Yuchi, different kinds of groups, plus runaway slaves. They moved into Florida and have repopulated it. The Seminole called them Cimarron, which is Spanish for runaway or fugitives, came to be called or anglicized the Seminoles. So the Seminole tribe moved here into especially North Florida to begin with and lived here for many years. So it was a frontier in Suwannee County at this point as the English period kicked off in 1763. These pretty much were the only guys that were around, the Seminole tribe. This one here is a drawing of Osceola, who is its most famous war leader, not a chief. A lot of people call him Chief Osceola. He was not actually a chief, but he was a war leader, I guess you could say. But that's the most famous Seminole. But there were many others before him that fought against the Europeans in this area for decades, to be honest. But they had populated this area. Meanwhile, the English had come in, and during that 20-year English period, just before the American Revolution begins, in 1774, this gentleman who was born in the colonies that later became the United States of America, his name was William Bartram. He was a naturalist. So he studied nature, and he traveled throughout those colonies from way up the New York area all the way down south to Florida, which was, again, English territory at that time. He traveled and wrote a book about it, a huge book with a long title that I'm not going to remember to repeat to you today. We'll get to it later on in one of the later presentations. But he wrote a classic of nature that is still studied sometimes today. And he talked about the Suwannee River. He, at that point, thought it was the most beautiful river he had ever seen. after all his travels through the colonies. So very interesting that he would say that. Not everybody thinks the Suwannee River is beautiful, but he did, and he's a naturalist, so he knows what he's talking about. So we'll go with him. We'll go with him. Now then, at the end of what we like to think of as the American Revolution, it ended in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. Now, the American Revolution, most Americans don't realize, was not just focused on fighting the 13 colonies. It actually widened to a worldwide war, one of the first real worldwide wars. Territories of Great Britain, of Spain, France, and others were fighting. So all the way, not just in the Americas, North America, but all the way over into the Indian Ocean and everywhere in between, they were fighting. And so America became kind of a side note to the larger war. So when the war ended, when the American colonies were granted independence in 1783, part of it was because Great Britain realized they needed to focus on defeating the Spanish and the French, and they agreed, hey, let's give up the American colonies because we need our other colonies back that we think are more valuable to us at this point, because the Americans are troublemakers and we're done with them anyway. So at the end of that war, part of it meant that they traded Florida back to Spain. Basically, England got some of their sugarcane-rich islands in the Caribbean back, and Spain got all of Florida, which Spain thought they kind of made out not so good because Florida was backwaters, very poor as a territory. And so that began what was called the Second Spanish Period. So that lasted from 1783 until 1821, when Florida was officially transferred to the United States of America. So with the Spanish out, or with the British out, the Spanish moved back in, but they had been fighting that world war with Great Britain. And so they were kind of poor, just like France, and that was one of the things that led up to the French Revolution, was they had been spending so much money in the Americas, and not only here in the Americas, but also throughout the world fighting the British. It caused a lot of issues, but that's a whole other discussion for a whole other day. But Spain realized they didn't have a lot of money to put into Florida, so what they did was like, you know what, let's open this place up, this backwoods area, this wilderness, to those newly created American colonies, that United States of America. Let's let some of those guys come in. Convert to Catholicism, yeah, you pay taxes, they can do kind of whatever they want. So that's kind of what happened was, American settlers moved in from the Carolinas, from Georgia, from other places, and moved into Spanish-held Florida. Well, that wasn't so politely received by the Seminole Indians, who by that point had been here for almost 100 years. And so there were several battles that broke out, several raids and massacres that broke out because of it. One particular raid on the Apalachicola River, I think about 50 American settlers were killed. So that upset the Americans, and so General Andrew Jackson and some troops moved in 1818 to begin what's called the First Seminole War. Fought the Seminole Indians, starting from basically Apalachicola over to the Suwannee River. He destroyed every Indian village, every Seminole Native American village he could find. Didn't really kill a lot of Native Americans because they fled, but he did destroy those villages, and also what's called Negro towns. You can see up here on this map from that period drawn by one of Jackson's lieutenants. There were Negro towns, which were those escaped runaway slaves, and also in this one it says Camp Bowlegs town. Billy Bowlegs was one of the Seminole leaders. The Native Americans, sometimes they would use the African Americans as slaves, sometimes they would give them their freedom, and they would establish their own towns close by. So anyway, Andrew Jackson came in and wiped out all these towns, or these villages, and he got to the Suwannee River, which you can see this is one of the several spellings of the Suwannee River over the years, S-U-W-A-N-E-Y. Again, one of many spellings over the years before it settled on what we have today. But he got to the Suwannee River, decided his mission was over, went back home to Tennessee, and then very shortly thereafter, Spain, which was already kind of in the process of thinking, we need to sell Florida. It's worthless to us. Once they realized that the United States could send an army in with impunity, they realized, you know what, let's sell it to the Americans before they just steal it from us or take it from us. So they sold the territory of Florida to the United States. And the negotiations really began in 1819, but again, you didn't have telephones or computers. So you would have to travel back and forth between the oceans, the Atlantic Ocean. So it took until 1821 to finalize everything and transfer it over. So Florida became, in 1821, an American territory. As part of that new American territory, it was divided up into 2 different counties. The Suwannee River was the dividing line. On the west side was Escambia, so everything west of the Suwannee was Escambia County. Everything to the east and south was the St. Johns County. So we had 2 counties. Suwannee River was the dividing line, and then as population grew, they would divide and subdivide and whatnot. So the Suwannee River was the dividing line. Meanwhile, they realized they had at the time 2 territorial capitals, East Florida's and West Florida's. So they had Pensacola and St. Augustine. They got tired of doing that, but they realized they needed a road between them so the politicians could travel and other people could travel. So they built what's called, well, at the time, the Spanish called it the Camino Real, the Royal Road. Well, they basically, the Americans used that as the basis of their own, what became the first federal highway in Florida. Our portion, like Tallahassee East, was called the Bellamy Road, built by a guy named John Bellamy who lived in the Tallahassee area. That's a portion of it, not in Suwannee County, but it kind of shows what it looked like. It was not much to it. And to be honest, John Bellamy kind of skimped on what he was supposed to do anyway. So he didn't make it as wide as it was supposed to have been. He didn't actually cut out all of the tree stumps. So your axles, as you're going on your wagon, you'd be hitting it and tearing up your axles. So he cut corners on a government job, and that never happens today. Definitely did back then too, it's not new. So Florida became an American territory. In the meantime, another war was fought with the with the Seminoles, and that was called the Second Seminole War. That's when Osceola became famous and whatnot. But that pushed out the Seminole Native Americans from North Florida. They were here in Suwannee County up until the end of that, and then they were pushed further south to South Florida, where nobody would ever want to live if they're an American, and so they were all pushed down there until the Third Seminole War, when they decided maybe we want some of that territory after all. Before, or in between the second and third second and third Seminole Wars, there was a guy by the name of Stephen Foster, who was a songwriter, and he was looking for a river to use in one of his songs. And he had originally picked the Petey River, but the song just didn't sound right, so he was looking on a map with his brother Morrison, and they found the Suwannee River and decided to cut out a couple letters and throw it in his song. So Old Folks at Home was the name of the song, but everybody knows it more as Way Down Upon the Suwannee River. So that was written in 1851, brought in a lot of people to Florida. Stephen Foster didn't really make any money off of it because he sold it to Mr. E.P. Christie. So he basically died more or less penniless a few years later. But he'd written a lot of songs. I believe he's the only songwriter who has 2 state anthems. State song, what's the other one? Kentucky. So Florida and Kentucky state songs were written by the same guy. So that, Way Down Upon the Suwannee River, Old Folks at Home, brought a lot of people into this area. Some of them, like my wife, were disappointed when they first saw the Suwannee River because they were expecting something huge. I mean, this whole song, famous song was written about it, and there's the Suwannee River. It's not near as big as I was thinking. She grew up near the Mississippi, so that kind of, that kind of hindered her ideas too. A lot of people moved into this area, and eventually in 1858, Suwannee County became its own county. It broke off, as I said, from Columbia. Now another county was created on that same day, on December 21st, 1858, New River. Anybody know where that is? Who hasn't been in here before? New River County. Everybody knows of that one, right? It's no longer one of the 67 counties. It was actually only New River County for a few years before something called the American Revolution popped up. And the county was renamed in honor of an officer who was killed, a Confederate officer who was killed by the name of Lieutenant Bradford. So Bradford County was originally called New River County. So we became a county. Our first county seat, anybody know what that one was? A lot of people want to say Houston, but it wasn't. It wasn't Live Oak either. It was the house of William Hines, who was a judge of this area. He had some property which looks like where Nobles Ferry Road crosses over I-10 in the northwestern portion of Suwannee County. He owned some property there that I've been able to find. I'm assuming that was the location. That was the temporary county seat until they could find better location. And by next year of that, by 1859, they had made that determination to be Houston, not Houston, Houston. So by the fall of 1859, our county records, when they first came into existence, that we've got them anyway, was being dated in Houston. Houston was the county seat for about 10 years before it became Live Oak. Anybody know the first deed recorded in Suwannee County? This is some of that. It's history, good, bad, or indifferent. It's history. The first recorded deed was the sale of a slave. So we have our records, knock on wood, go all the way back to the foundation of the county when slavery was still in effect in the South. And so we do have those kind of records, good or bad. We still have them. It's part of our history. So Suwannee became a county. A couple years later, we've got this thing called the Civil War. We'll talk more about it in that time period. An argument of whether it was actually a civil war or not. But the victors call it Civil War, so we will call it a Civil War in today's presentation. Florida, again, it was backwards, backwoods, frontier, not much going on. Out of the Confederate states, it was the least populated. And pretty much south of what's now Ocala, there was nothing there except for Key West. So there wasn't a lot of reason for the North to come in, except after 1863, with the fall of Vicksburg. Vicksburg fell the same day that Gettysburg was going on, or the last day of Gettysburg was going on. July of 1863, Florida became very important because of all the animals, the cows, and other food and things that we could deliver to the Confederacy. So the North decided maybe we should invade there. They'd already hit Jacksonville. They already captured Cedar Key, Fernandina Beach, Pensacola. They basically captured the big places, but the interior was still held by the Confederacy. Well, in 1863, the next year was going to be an election, 1864, and President Lincoln was up against a former general of his, George McClellan, who was basically fighting to end the Civil War, to let the South go on its own, and just be two countries at that point. And so a lot of people that were supporting Lincoln said, you know what, we need to bring Florida in. Maybe we can get enough people to swear allegiance to the United States that we can have them vote Lincoln back into office. And so in early 1864, another invasion was held by the North into Jacksonville, third or fourth time, I think, in the war. And eventually they started marching towards the capital of Tallahassee. But what their main focus was, according to the generals anyway, was to destroy this bridge across the Suwannee River in Suwannee County. It was a railroad bridge that had been completed a couple years before. And it was the only railroad basically in Florida at that time that was operational, going all the way from Jacksonville over past Tallahassee. And it was the one bringing in all those cattle and all those other food supplies to other places in the Confederacy. And so they were focused on destroying that bridge, which was located in what's now the Suwannee River State Park. And that was the primary goal of their invasion. Now again, they also wanted to capture, if they could go all the way to Tallahassee, great, capture that capital, force enough people or convince enough people to vote for being part of the Union again. That would help Lincoln's chances of being elected or re-elected as president. So they started marching to the west. They were stopped at the Battle of Olustee or Ocean Pond, depending on which side of the Mason-Dixon line that you're from. But the Battle of Olustee was a Confederate victory. It was Florida's largest Civil War battle. Not big compared to like Gettysburg, but it was big. It was our biggest Civil War battle. And the Confederacy defeated the Union, pushed them back to Jacksonville, where they stayed the rest of the war, saved that railroad bridge in Suwannee County, and allowed us to continue to support and feed the Confederacy. But the war ended in 1865. The Confederacy was defeated. The United States became one country again, and a lot of Northerners moved into Florida, including folks like this, John and Nancy Parsley, who were from Massachusetts and New York, then Ohio, and finally into Florida. John Parsley was a businessman in the sawmill timber industry. His wife seemed to have come from a well-off family, seemed to have a lot of money. John had gained and lost a couple fortunes already when he moved into Florida. So he moved into the small hamlet at the time called Live Oak, which was just basically a stop on the railroad. It originally was called Live Oak Station. And built his house and laid out what we know as downtown Live Oak today. So why do we have an Ohio Avenue? That's where they came from. Why do we have a Parsley Street? Their last name. Why do we have Howard Street? That was one of their sons. Wilbur Street, another son. So basically, they laid out downtown Live Oak as we know it. Because downtown Live Oak, if you want to call it that, the original spot was several blocks to the west on Houston, where Houston meets the railroad. That was the original downtown Live Oak. But they grew up that new downtown area, established a lumber mill, and a lot of people moved in because of that. Unfortunately for Mr. Parsley, he died in 1868 of what looks to be malaria. We had a lot of ponds and stuff around. So he died of malaria in 1868, but his wife, Nancy, continued business and lots of other businesses, whether it was schools, whether it was the lumber business, hotels, all kinds of stuff she was into. And so she lived for another 30 years or so. And actually, the courthouse location is because of them also. Because it was in Houston, they wanted something a little closer to their home, which was across the street. And so they provided the property for that courthouse to be built. But that's a story for another day in more detail. So people were moving in from the north. People were moving in from all over because also Live Oak at the time had the only railroad coming into Florida. So if you traveled into Florida by railroad, you came through, your first stop basically was Live Oak. Plus it had the north-south running and east-west running. So it was a junction of railroads. So a lot of people decided to set up shop here in Live Oak in Suwannee County and surrounding area. Not only was it business like in town, but also out in the county, we had all that timber, that virgin timber that a lot of folks wanted to get into. So these sawmills, these timbermen, these turpentine industries moved in, and the demand was so great that in the 1870s, they actually hired, through the convict lease system, all the convicts of the state prison system in Florida. They were working in Suwannee County, working on turpentine, working on cutting trees, eventually working on building railroads. So that convict camp, or that lease system, that was set up when Reconstruction ended, not just in Florida, but other states, carried on for about 50 years and brought in a lot of industry also into Suwannee County. So we had, at one point, all the state prisoners working, and other times half the state prisoners working in Suwannee County on these things. Life was brutal, life was short, but it was that for about everybody else too. Meanwhile, as the 1870s, 1880s roll through, we've got steamboats coming in number on the Suwannee River. Now, before the Civil War, we had 2 or 3 steamboats through the years. But after the war, that was the heyday of steamboating on the Suwannee River. You had dozens at some point, sometimes dozens of steamboats sailing up and down the river. That was like the cool thing to do. The one on the left, probably the most famous, is the Belle of Suwannee, built by Robert Ivy, who lived in the Branford area, who actually named Branford. But he built that one. There was a honeymoon suite on it that was very well known. They would serve such local delicacies as catfish. That was a delicacy back then. Also gopher gumbo sometimes, which would be illegal now because of the gopher tortoises. But they sailed up and down the river. They also transported, because you didn't have all those railroads yet. They were building, and eventually those railroads would end the steamboating on the Suwannee River. But in the 1870s, 1880s, up to the 1890s, you didn't have enough railroads to reach all the areas of Suwannee County. And so these steamboats were the cheapest way to transport goods and people. So a lot of people rode them over the years. The one on the right, that steamboat, is the city of Hawkinsville, which was the last steamboat on the Suwannee River, and she lasted until the 19-teens, and I think she sank in 1923 down Old Town. So, and steamboating lasted for about 40 years, really, that heyday, that era. Partly because of this, but partly because of lots of other things, those late 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s made Suwannee County a tourist destination. I like to joke that it was the Disney World of the day. People would come from all over the world to visit our famous springs, whether it was Suwannee Springs, whether it was Dowling Park, or even White Springs over in Hamilton County. People would come thinking that sulfur water would heal them. And so we have invalids coming, we have old soldiers with war wounds coming, we've got folks with arthritis, we've got, at the time it was called female problems, women problems. They would come for all kinds of treatment that this sulfur water was supposed to help them with. They provided all kinds of luxuries for this area, hunting, fishing, steamboating, whatever you want to do, excursions. And this brought in so many people, not just to Suwannee County, but Live Oak in particular, that by 1905, Live Oak was the 5th largest city in the whole state of Florida. You had Pensacola and Tampa and Key West and Jacksonville, not in that order, but those are the 4 larger ones. And then Live Oak, bigger than Tallahassee, bigger than Ocala, bigger than Orlando, bigger than Miami in 1905. People were coming for this kind of stuff. People were coming for all the industry that was in Suwannee County. But not only that, we also were producing lots of cotton. A lot of the world's supply, or the United States supply, depending on who you look at, of Sea Island cotton, which was a very fine, short staple cotton. So we were producing stuff for world consumption, whether it was our springs or whether it was our industries. Unfortunately, people started finding out that sulfur water really doesn't do anything for you. And the boll weevil came in about 1915 and wiped out our cotton crop. And a lot of other things happened. Florida, the rest of Florida was opened up by Henry Flagler. So people decided, you know what, maybe we should go to the beaches instead. Or South Florida, which 100 years before nobody wanted to live in, like the Seminoles. And so Live Oak was no longer the 5th largest city. But it is what it is. In reality, we actually weren't any bigger than we are today. Live Oak is about the same size as it was 100 years ago, 115 years ago. Just Miami didn't have 2 million people back then. So as the 19-teens shift in the 1920s, we had a lot of additional growth in Suwannee County. Total population in 1920 was about 20,000. So we're still not talking about a huge county population. We had about 20,000 people. We were still one of the largest producers in the state of cotton, peanuts, corn, hogs, and pecans or pecans, depending on where you're from. We had 102 schools in 1920. A lot of schools, again, mainly one-room schools. One of them was the Suwannee High School, which had its first soccer program in 1922, apparently the first in the state, and we were state champs the next year. Yay us. This is the 1922. That's pretty much that original group. They were nicknamed, this would not be politically correct today, but they were nicknamed the Fighting Hebrews because there were several Jews on that soccer team. Others on here are very important people that were important for decades later, people like Horry T. Hare and Alfred Erith, who was an attorney. So lots of people. Horry Hare was a state representative and whatnot, a senator, I believe, at one point too. So we were big because of that. Also in 1924, Ruby Strickland, who had been the postmistress of Dowling Park, like her father before her. But in 1924, by that point, she had moved to Live Oak, and she was elected as mayor of Live Oak. And she was the first female mayor south of the Mason-Dixon line after universal suffrage. So only 5 years after all the women in the United States got the right to vote, she became mayor of Live Oak. So that was a big first for Live Oak also. Served 2 different terms. Was well-liked, well-respected by the community. As 1920s end, 1929, we've got that thing called the Great Depression starting, and that hit us not as hard as other places because we were already kind of poor. So, poor rural area didn't get hit as hard as, say, New York City and some of these big cities, but we still suffered along. As the 1930s rolled in, we were continuing what programs we could. This picture is a picture from either 1933 or 1934. The description on the background says 33-34. But this is, at the time, that was the clerk's official records vault in the courthouse. Today it is a judicial hearing room, but the funny thing is, well, a couple things actually. The guy on the left is Bob Miller, who was the clerk of the court then. The guy on the right is J.L. McMullen, who just a couple years after this would become at the time, the youngest elected official in U.S. history when he became Suwannee County's clerk of the court, my boss's predecessor. At the time, you had to be 21 to be able to vote. Mr. J.L., before he died, told me that he had to get a special dispensation by the governor to actually become deputy clerk because he was too young to be sworn in otherwise. Because he was too young to vote. But he became the youngest elected official in U.S. history at 21 or 22. again, when the voting age was 21. Now, and since that time, there have been younger ones because the voting age was lowered. But at the time, he was the youngest in history. So that was a great honor for Suwannee County also. Served for several terms. But the other funny thing about this picture is if you go to the courthouse today and go into our records vault, you will see pretty much all of those books, all of those filing cabinets are still there. A little bit worse for wear, but they're still there. So it's a part of history, that connection of history from 90 years ago at this point. As the 1940s rolled in, World War II had started out in Europe in 1939, September of 1939, so you got the Second World War. We stayed out of it for a little bit, but in 1940 we realized that we were going to be getting into it sooner or later, so our National Guard units were called up, including our National Guard in Florida. On November 25th, 1940, they were called up to service. Now, our National Guard unit, our local unit, nicknamed the Suwannee Rifles and other things over the years, were very highly trained soldiers, and actually up until a few years ago at least, they had been in more conflicts and called up more times than any other National Guard unit in Florida. So they were highly trained. And so what they did in 1940, once they were called up for duty, they went to Fort Benning and other places and trained people how to be soldiers. And so that happened as the World War II started out in 1941 with the United States becoming involved after Pearl Harbor was attacked. Our folks continued to train for a little while, train other soldiers, but then half went to the Pacific Theater and half went to the Atlantic Theater, and they served in combat until the end of the war in 1945. In Suwannee County, we lost about 50 people whose names are honored on a memorial there in the downtown area. And again, did a great service for our county. Now, when they came back in 1945, things were a little bit different. There were more women in the workforce. Things were changing all throughout the country and the world, mainly for the good. So by the 1950s, by the time they come around, we have things being pushed like electricity, phone service for the entire county. Because up until that point, if you didn't live in Live Oak or sometimes Branford, you basically had no electricity, no phone service, no septic, none of that kind of stuff. You had the outhouses. So in the 1950s, the county got all that kind of stuff. Biggest thing though in the 1950s was in 1952, well-known and well-liked Dr. Clifford Leroy Adams was killed by an African-American woman named Ruby McCullum. It's a good story, one that I spent an entire presentation discussing in the 1950s era. Brought a lot of notoriety to Suwannee County, not just because of that, but it also the entire country about this idea that a white man could take an African-American woman by force or otherwise, coercion, and have relations with her. And so she eventually had enough. And there was lots of other stuff, again, we'll talk about. I don't want to get into it today. But for various reasons, she shot and killed him. And that was national news. National news. And that's the reason I'm in newspapers around the world, is because of the discussion of that story. Some books have come out, some videos, some documentaries have come out. And the last 15 years especially, there have been several. Trying to figure out what happened and why, and as our understanding of things have changed over the years, just trying to figure out the whys and hows. So it's an interesting story. Again, we'll get into more detail in that period of American history, in Florida and Suwannee County's history. So 1950s kind of ends in 1957, the big thing being the Florida Sheriff's Boys Ranch is established here in just north of Live Oak, right down the road from me, to be honest. So that's how the 50s end, on a good note. Well, the 60s start, things are progressing until 1964. We've got this thing called Hurricane Dora. Now, we just went through Tropical Storm Elsa, which was nothing. But you never know, because it could be Hurricane Dora, or it could be Tropical Storm Debbie in 2012. Hurricane Dora hit in September of 1964. This is a photograph, aerial photograph of downtown Live Oak. The courthouse is towards the top of that picture, center picture. Downtown was flooded. Lots of rain. It was Suwannee County's worst natural disaster up until 2012 when Debbie hit us. Governor came through on boat on Howard Street. There's several famous pictures of him traveling by boat down Howard Street. President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, talked to the county commissioners as he was flying over the destruction site to basically pledge them federal aid and whatnot. So it was a big deal. Lots of damage. The community banded together. Some changes were made. Several of these buildings were torn down because of it. Other changes were made, but we moved on, we progressed, and got better. So as the 70s roll around, we've got more industry or more business coming in, places like Babcock and Goldkist, things like that that may not be called that today, but various big industries came in. But at the end of that decade, what most people know about the 70s in Suwannee County is this nice man, quote unquote, named Ted Bundy, who was anything but nice. Serial killer Ted Bundy. 1978, he killed his last victim, who was a middle school student from Lake City. He brought her over to Suwannee County and killed her. Her remains were found, I think, 6 weeks later, close to the Suwannee River State Park. He was eventually arrested, tried, and it actually started, the trial for Kimberly Leach's murder started at the Suwannee County Courthouse, but it was moved to Orlando. And so most of the trial was down there. After he'd already been convicted of the Chi Omega murders over in Tallahassee, he killed several girls over there first before he came to Lake City and to Suwannee County. He was found guilty. He was sentenced to death. He held off for a few years. He was not executed until 1989. He admitted to something like 30 or 35 murders, and the numbers we just don't know for sure. Could have been low as 30, as high as in the hundreds or 120. So we don't know. One of the serial killers that came through Suwannee County. The last known that I can think of was Allie Muernos. We'll talk about her way later. But she came through the 1990s. As the 1980s moved in, we had Reaganomics come in, more business, more incentivization. So places like Spirit of the Suwannee were open. Other big deals. Suwannee became more of an ecotourism destination. Our springs, I believe it's Royal Springs, I was told on the top left, the bottom right is Suwannee Springs. Places like that, people came because of nature. Just like 150 years ago, people came to visit those springs because of its healing properties. Well, today they don't come for the healing properties, they come for the relaxation, the rest, the back to nature. And so Suwannee County has grown and continues to grow even today as people move here to settle in a tranquil life, get away from the hustle and bustle of the big cities. They're looking for something a little bit quieter. We've got, between the ecotourism of the springs, we've got more springs and more caves than about anybody else in Florida. Lots of people come in from all over the world just to dive those springs. Hundreds of thousands of people come every year to go to the Spirit of the Suwannee and other music venues that are held there and other places around Suwannee County. So a lot of people, including some of y'all, I'm sure, moved here because of the tranquility and usual peacefulness of this area. So that is Suwannee County. We continue to grow. We continue to adapt to change. And we still have our roots, but we're still learning and growing because of it. So that ends the overview. Under an hour overview of Suwannee County. Again, I appreciate it. Hope to see y'all back next month. And if nothing else, see y'all next time.